Summer 1942. The Second World War is at its peak. In the western lowlands between the Don and Volga rivers, fierce battles are raging. The Germans are pushing toward Voronezh and Stalingrad. On the night of June 12th, a newly formed all-female air regiment takes to the skies for its first combat mission. Each crew will fly at least 6 sorties before dawn. By morning, this battalion of young women will have delivered a crushing blow to the enemy and earned a name that will haunt German soldiers for the rest of the war: the Night Witches. Flying exclusively under the cover of darkness, they master the art of silent flight, cutting their engines, gliding low over the terrain, and approaching their targets with precision and stealth. With the grace of women and the courage of warriors, they drop their deadly payloads with chilling accuracy. Over the course of the war, the Night Witches carried out more than 30,000 bombing missions and dropped over 23,000 tons of explosives on enemy targets. Their contribution to the outcome of the Second World War was nothing short of extraordinary. Among the famed Night Witches was our own legendary compatriot, Khiuaz Dospanova. Her life is a story of courage, resilience, and unwavering service to her people, a symbol of unbreakable will, patriotism, and fearlessness. Her heroic legacy lives on as a lasting inspiration to generations, a reminder of the immense price paid for victory. She was born in the spring of 1922 in the village of Ganyushkino, then part of the Guryev region, today's Ataral region of Kazakhstan. Her childhood unfolded against the harsh backdrop of the 1920s, a time of forced collectivization, famine, and political repression. Despite these hardships, Khiuaz's family managed to give her a strong education. From an early age, she stood out among her peers. Curious, determined, and eager to learn, she excelled in her studies, took part in school life, and quickly emerged as a natural leader. Khiuaz served as secretary of the school's Komsomol youth chapter and as a pioneer squad leader, displaying early signs of initiative and organizational talent. Her father, Khiuaz Dospanov, served in the local police. Her mother, Miruert, was a school teacher. As the eldest of 5 children, Khiuaz helped raise her younger siblings, supporting her parents from a young age. Her passion for aviation emerged early, back in her school years. Inspired by the daring feats of Soviet pilots, Khiuaz dreamed of taking to the skies. As a child, she would spend hours staring upward, imagining herself gliding between clouds, dipping low and soaring high again. The chance to enroll in a local flying club was a turning point. Alongside her academic studies, she began mastering the basics of flight. At that time, young girls across the Soviet Union were deeply inspired by 3 women aviators: Grizadubova, Osipenko, and Marina Raskova, who completed a non-stop flight lasting over 26 hours. Беспосадочный перелет, они летели более 26 часов. Потом надо понять, как работала идеология. That achievement was all over newspapers. The state's ideology turned their flight into a national event. Becoming a pilot became a symbol of strength and purpose for an entire generation. Khiuaz Dospanova was among those girls. She, too, enrolled in the flying club, and it changed the course of her life. Одна из них наша Khiuaz Dospanova, которую тут же записала в свой аэроклуб. In 1940, Khiuaz graduated from school with a gold medal, the highest academic honor, and earned her reserve pilot's license. Confident in her calling, she set out for Moscow, determined to enroll at the Zhukovsky Air Force Academy. But her dream was not to be. At the time, military aviation schools did not accept women. Undeterred, she applied to the first Moscow Medical Institute and was admitted without entrance exams. She loved the city with all her heart. The Arbat, Чистые пруды, cozy courtyards nestled among majestic buildings. She was 18, a student, carefree, with her whole life ahead of her. But that bright chapter lasted only a few short months. In June 1941, the war began. From the memoirs of Khiuaz Dospanova. We were finishing our final exams when one morning we heard the shocking news. Hitler's forces had attacked our country. That summer morning, June 22nd, 1941, we suddenly felt like adults. Something immense and irreversible had entered our lives.
Attention. This is Moscow speaking. Today, June the 22nd, at 4 a.m., without a declaration of war, German forces attacked our country.
From the very outset of the war, Khiuaz understood her place was not in a university lecture hall, but at the front, where her country needed her most. The call to fly and to fight for her homeland became her purpose, and she pursued it with unwavering resolve. At the time, under the leadership of Marina Raskova, the Soviet Union began forming all-female aviation regiments. Khiuaz Dospanova, together with her university classmate Tatyana Sumarokova, succeeded in being accepted into the 46th Guards Bomber Aviation Regiment.
Marina Mikhailovna Raskova made history as the first woman to be awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union for her extraordinary achievements in aviation. Leveraging her influence and personal connections at the highest levels, including direct access to Joseph Stalin, she secured permission to establish all-female aviation units as an official part of the Red Army Air Force. One of the first regiments formed under this order was the 588th Night Light Bomber Aviation Regiment.
It was Marina Raskova who personally led the formation of the regiment, handpicking cadets not just for their flight skills but for their readiness to face the brutal demands of war. Selection was uncompromising. Only women who combined technical excellence with unshakable character and discipline were entrusted with the mission.
They truly believed in the justice of the communist ideal. They believed with absolute conviction that humanity's future lay in socialism and eventually in communism. Their loyalty was to the people, and in many ways, Stalin's entire policy was geared toward that vision. Of course, they had no real understanding of the darker chapters of history that we know today. The purges, the repression that swept across the Soviet Union. Kazakhstan suffered terribly. We had Asharshalak, the famine. We had mass collectivization. Nearly half of the Kazakh population have perished from hunger. But at the time, they didn't think about any of that. Their focus was singular: to defeat the enemy that had invaded their common homeland, the Soviet Union.
The newly formed regiment was placed under the command of Captain Yevdokia Bershanskaya, a seasoned pilot with over a decade of experience. She was not only a masterful aviator, but a natural leader whose authority and discipline forged the unit into one of the most effective combat formations in the Soviet Air Force. Under her command, the regiment served through the entire war, taking part in some of its most dangerous and demanding operations. Why did Marina Raskova decide to create a women's aviation regiment? I believe one of the main reasons was the growing number of women in the Soviet Union. and particularly in Kazakhstan, who already held pilot licenses, had parachute training, and possessed real aviation skills.
Имели навыки, прыжков с парашютом и другие навыки. Понятное дело, навыки они были и у девушек.
In Kazakhstan, this kind of training was increasingly available to young women. But in other regions, in much of Central Asia and the Caucasus, such cases were extremely rare. In some places, they were not at all. Here, there were not isolated exceptions. The regiment even had its own code of conduct, 12 rules in total. And the very first one was, be proud to be a woman. Khiuaz was admitted into the ranks of the legendary Women's Aviation Regiment without hesitation. She met every requirement with quiet confidence. Her memory was extraordinary, her mind analytical and alert. She absorbed new knowledge with ease and had a natural sense for direction and terrain. Her eyesight and hearing were flawless. Training was intense. The women learned to fly at night, to maneuver in combat, and to navigate in near-complete darkness. They were taught to approach targets in silence and to strike with pinpoint accuracy, skills that would later become the defining signature of their regiment. The 588th Regiment was composed entirely of women from its founding to the final days of the war. Not a single man served among its pilots, mechanics, navigators, technicians, or even among the ground staff. This defining feature set it apart as a singular chapter in the history of global aviation. For their unwavering dedication and courage in battle, the regiment earned an unofficial nickname among fellow soldiers, Dunkas Regiment. It was a light-hearted nod to its all-women personnel and to the name of their commanding officer, Yevdokia Bershanskaya. Within this sisterhood, Khiuaz found her closest comrades in arms.
First of all, they lacked even the most basic uniforms. The women were issued men's clothing, which of course gave some men an excuse to mock them. They had to tailor everything themselves, sewing and fitting it by hand. Equipment was scarce. The aircraft were outdated. Old U-2 biplanes, which people jokingly called crop dusters. There's even a famous moment in the film Only Old Men Are Going to Battle, where one of the male pilots mocks the women, calling their plane a sewing machine. In the beginning, both Soviet men and the Germans laughed at the idea of a women's battalion. The Nazis called them Russisch Faner, Russian plywood. But the women proved they were capable of far more, and in time they earned respect from both their comrades and their enemies.
By the spring of 1942, the regiment had completed its training and was deemed combat ready. On May 23rd, they took to the skies, bound for the front. 4 days later, they arrived at the battlefield. At the time, the regiment counted 115 members, all young women, just 17 to 22 years old. Soon to be tested in the crucible of war. They were attached to the 218th Night Bomber Aviation Division and thrust directly into active operations. This marked the beginning of their remarkable combat record. Night sorties deep behind enemy lines, audacious strikes on strategic targets, and evasive maneuvers under relentless anti-aircraft fire and fighter pursuit. The regiment flew across multiple sectors of the front, often completing dozens of missions in a single night. Their story endures as one of the most compelling legacies of the war. The names of these women are etched into its history. Here is how Khiuaz Dospanova remembered her very first mission. It was our first mission. We crossed the front line and reached the target. I completed my task. Suddenly, enemy searchlights locked onto us. And I said, if there's a chance we'll be captured, dive. Head straight for the ground. Better to die than to be taken prisoner, especially as girls, falling into German hands. But eventually they lost us in the darkness. We crossed back over the line and made it back safely. That was my first combat flight.
Ты летишь в самолете,
Imagine flying at night at low altitude, just 2 people in the cockpit.
вас 2 человека в экипаже. От того,
The navigator plots the course, she decides when to drop the bombs, her judgment can determine the success of the mission. And the pilot, she holds your life in her hands. One mistake and you may not come back.
от того, как самолет поведет твой летчик, зависит твоя жизнь. Вы понимаете, это плечо, твое плечо.
You're shoulder to shoulder the entire time. These were young women, open-hearted, full of trust, full of feeling.
Как никогда. И они открыты этой любви, дружбе. Как они мстили.
And that made their bonds unbreakable. When a friend was killed, it was deeply personal. They'd write her name on the side of the plane for Oksana. That kind of gesture says it all. It was absolute unity. One woman depended on the other completely.
Вдвоем. Она надеется на тебя, ты надеешься на другого.
Ну, понятно, что такой самолет, который...
Of course, a plane made of wooden frames and canvas wasn't much of threat to Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs, which is why they hardly ever flew during the day.
Поэтому они днем фактически не летали. Но я в 69-м или в 70-м году...
I remember back in 1969 or maybe 1970, I was finishing school and went to Moscow for winter break. Back then, it was practically mandatory to visit Lenin's mausoleum. While I was there, I also went to what was then called the Museum of the Armed Forces of the Soviet Union. Not sure what it's called now. I went specifically to see the PO-2. I wanted to look at the actual aircraft. I walked up to it and stood there, trying to understand what kind of machine it really was. If I had to describe it, it was barely more than a frame with an engine. I remember pressing my finger against the fabric stretched over the wing, just close over a few wooden ribs. It sank under the pressure. You could almost poke a hole right through it. That plane could have been brought down with a slingshot. And yet, these girls, 19, maybe 20 years old, flew 5 to 10 missions a night to bomb enemy positions.
Чтобы бомбить позиции противника, фактически они были...
They were like kamikaze. Each flight was a gamble with death.
From her earliest combat flights, Khiuaz Dospanova demonstrated remarkable composure and skill as a navigator. Guiding her crew through the darkness, she steered them toward their targets with unwavering precision, relying only on the faint silhouettes of the land bathed in moonlight. She flew across multiple theaters of war, first on the southern front, then through the fierce campaigns in the North Caucasus and Transcaucasia. Later, the regiment was redeployed to Ukraine and Belarus, playing a critical role in the liberation of Nazi-occupied territories.
Marina Roskova understood what awaited these young women. They were not just going to war, they were heading into a fight where no quarter would be given. And so, they prepared, with ruthless discipline, day and night. Physical endurance was only the beginning. They trained as mechanics, learning to maintain and repair their aircraft with their own hands. They studied the night skies, learning to navigate by the stars. Before each mission, the route had to be memorized down to the smallest detail, not just the roads and rivers, but the shape of every village, the layout of courtyards, the silhouettes of buildings likely to appear in the moonlight. Because once airborne, everything changed. There would be no second chances. And in those early days of preparation, the danger was no obstruction. 2 crews were lost before their training was even complete.
Each flight was a brush with death. The U-2 offered no protection, no armor, no modern avionics, no defensive weaponry. Against German fighters, it was virtually defenseless. And yet, the women found a way. They flew low, skimming the earth, vanishing into the folds of the landscape. They struck only under cover of darkness, relying on stealth, nerve, and timing. As they neared the target, they would cut the engine, gliding in silence, then drop their bombs with chilling precision. To the enemy, it was as if the night itself had turned against them. And so they gave them a name, the Night Witches.
Скорость у них была от 100 до...
Flew at speeds between 100 and 120 kilometers per hour, slow by any military standard, and they could only fly at low altitude. It was both their weakness and their advantage. Flying so low kept them below the reach of German radar, but it also left them terrifyingly exposed. A single bullet could bring them down. The aircraft themselves were made of canvas and wood, flammable, fragile, and unforgiving. The Germans called them Russisch Faner, Russian plywood, and in truth, that's exactly what they were. There was no cockpit canopy, no protection, only 2 crew members, pilot and navigator, seated side by side in the open air. But the design had one crucial advantage: dual controls. If the pilot was wounded or killed, the navigator could take over and bring the plane home.
Взять вождение и посадку самолета.
There's a story. The name may be lost to history of a young pilot killed mid-flight. The navigator seated behind her took control and landed the aircraft on her own. They flew between 8 and 18 sorties each night. By the time they returned, they were completely spent, unable to stand. Other girls would lift them from the cockpit, carrying them to rest. And it wasn't only the flight crews. The mechanics and technicians were girls too. 1 aircraft meant 5 women, 2 in the air, 3 on the ground.
То есть вообще один самолет – это 5 человек. Это экипаж 2 человека, и 3 человека – это механики и техники. Вот чтобы бомбу одну подвесить, она 100 килограмм весит.
They loaded 100-kilogram bombs by hand again and again. There was no special equipment, no help, just strength and rhythm and will. Soon they stopped waiting to be asked. As soon as a plane touched down, they rushed to it, whoever it belonged to, and worked together to prepare it for the next flight.
Со всех сторон набегали и помогали подвесить бомбы. И сократили вот вообще.
That small act of instinct and unity cut their turnaround time in half, from 30 minutes to 15. It was a feat, a quiet, daily feat, and with each mission, they risked everything. The courage of young Khiuaz left a lasting impression on everyone who served beside her. Petite and slender, with a shoe size no larger than 33, she possessed a spirit far greater than her frame. She flew without a parachute deliberately to make room for extra ammunition. That one decision allowed the aircraft to carry an additional 20 kilograms of bombs. In warmer months, her crew would complete 6 to 8 sorties in a single night. In winter, when the nights stretched longer, that number rose to 10, sometimes even 12.
The regiment's combat record speaks for itself. They destroyed or disabled 17 enemy crossings, 9 railway trains, 2 major railway stations, 26 depots filled with ammunition and equipment, 12 fuel tankers, 176 military and transport vehicles, 86 enemy firing positions, and 11 high-powered searchlights used to expose targets and track Soviet aircraft at night. Their precision strikes and relentless night raids ignited 811 fires and triggered 1,092 major explosions, a measure of both their accuracy and their impact.
У девчонок был страх – это прожектора.
The girls were afraid. What frightened them the most were the searchlights, when enemy beams locked onto their planes. So what did they do? They flew in formations of 3. 1 aircraft would draw the lights, and once the beams locked onto her, she would drop altitude abruptly. While the attention was fixed on her, another would begin the bombing run. Then the third would complete her strike and exit the same way. It was not just courage, it was tactical thinking. Navigators had to determine the exact moment to release the bombs. They came up with their own solution, not a complex device, but a simple method. They cut a square opening in the floor of the plane and used it to judge speed, altitude, and distance. From that opening, Khiuaz Dospanova could call the strike, target. That gives you a sense of the skill, the intuition, and the precision it took to fly and fight in total darkness.
И умение летать ночью.
The war took a heavy toll on Khiuaz. She had to endure freezing nights, push through relentless fatigue, and live with a constant fear of never returning from a mission. All the while, a quiet ache of homesickness lingered within her. She barely slept as their missions took place at night, and during the day, slipping into short, uneasy sleep, she would find herself back in Kazakhstan. She dreamt of the steppe, the endless blue sky, her mother's hands, and her father's smile. She believed the war would end and that she would return. That hope helped her bear the cold, the fear, and the pain of loss. And there was so much of it. From the memoirs of Khiuaz Dospanova. War. We learned to go without sleep. We learned to endure hunger. We knew that our homeland, the Soviet people, were giving us everything they could. They fed us, clothed us, supplied us with weapons and ammunition. They worked around the clock, sacrificing just as we did, going hungry, going without rest, waiting anxiously for any word from the front. And we fought the fascists with unshakable faith in victory. That faith gave us strength. August 1st, 1943. That night, the night witches set out on another combat mission. As they neared their target, they noticed an unsettling stillness. Enemy artillery remained silent, showing no signs of activity. The absence of resistance was unusual, but the crews continued their approach. Then the trap was sprung. A formation of German night fighters launched a sudden assault from the opposite direction. The Wehrmacht had long sought to eliminate the women of the 588th Regiment, and on this night, they deployed a squadron of fast, heavily armed aircraft, led by German fighter ace Josef Kotsiok, who had received Nazi Germany's highest military honor, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, just days earlier. In the span of minutes, Kotsiok downed 3 Soviet bombers. Flying without parachutes, their crew stood no chance of survival. A 4th aircraft was destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. By the end of the night, 8 Soviet aviators were dead. The hardest thing in the war is losing your comrades. Nothing was more painful than that. I saw our planes burn twice with my own eyes. But in total, we lost 12 aircraft to fire. 12 times the girls burned alive, and we knew it. We saw it. Even from the airfield, we watched the planes go down in flames, falling like torches from the sky. You could see it clearly from the airfield when the planes caught fire in the sky. The moment it began to fall apart, you knew no one could make it out alive. Afterwards, we come back to the airfield and place a glass on the table for the one who would never return. But their lives were not defined by war alone. On days when the skies were quiet or weather grounded their missions, these hardened aviators allowed themselves to simply be young again. They sang, they danced, and of course they dreamt of love. Her comrades called her Katya, the Russian name they gave Khiuaz. She was vibrant, full of laughter, full of life. There was a lightness in her, as if she understood that each day might be her last, and chose to live it fully. From the memoirs of Khiuaz Dospanova. From the residents of the liberated villages and settlements, we learned of the monstrous lies the fascists had spread as they retreated. They told people that our women's regiment was made up of criminals, sentenced by the Soviet state and sent to redeem their guilt in blood by bombing and killing children, the elderly, and civilians. This was how the Nazis tried to terrify the local population. Earlier, we had heard from our commanders and political officers that Hitler had promised his soldiers an Iron Cross and a short leave home for every women's crew they managed to shoot down. That's why enemy gunners and fighter pilots hunted us so obsessively. It seems our little PO2s caused them more damage than they cared to admit. Khiuaz first came face to face with death, not in combat but on her own airfield. At the time, the area where her regiment was based was under frequent enemy attack. To prevent giving away their position, the command banned all signal lights and visual markers, both on the ground and in the air. During one of those landings, 2 aircraft approached simultaneously. One of them carried Khiuaz. They collided.
Меня из кабины выбросило, не знаю куда.
I was thrown from the cockpit. I don't even know where. When I came to, I asked the pilot, "Yulia, are you alive?" She said, "Yes, I am." I asked, "Where are we?" She said, "I don't know. I guess we're on the ground." I said, "Yulia, where am I?" She said, "I don't know that either." Then the searchlights came on. They started looking for us, and eventually they found us. Turns out I had landed on the wing of the aircraft. I'd been thrown onto the wing. They were unconscious. It was terrifying. For us, it was truly horrifying. 3 were killed, or rather 2 died instantly. The 3rd was critically injured and died later on the operating table. The 4th, Khiuaz, was thrown high into the air and landed far from the wreckage. Her body was shattered. Most of her bones were broken and her legs were crushed. She was presumed dead and taken to the morgue. It was only when the body of the 3rd girl, the one who had died during surgery, was brought in that someone noticed Khiuaz was still alive. That was her first miracle. The 2nd came in the hospital as well. She was brought in and unconscious, delirious, burning with fever. A medical board convened and decided both of her legs needed to be amputated. But the chief physician hesitated. He said, "She's just a girl. How can she live without her legs?" Khiuaz was in critical condition. The bones in both her legs had been shattered. Despite numerous surgeries and a long recovery, it became clear she would never return to the air. And for her, that was the deepest loss. What could be more devastating? To feel useless and helpless. She was officially classified as having a 2nd-degree disability. Khiuaz fought back tears, but she made a promise to herself whatever it took, she would return to the front. And she did. With a shortage of trained pilots, her comrades carried her to the aircraft, lifting her gently into the cockpit. Time and time again, she returned to the skies. Mission after mission, she flew into combat. It speaks to her resilience, to the fact that she simply couldn't act otherwise, and I'll emphasize this. It's the nomadic spirit in her. It's in her blood, the instinct to survive in any environment, under any condition. The cold was brutal. They flew in open cockpits at an altitude, and if it was freezing on the ground, it was far worse in the sky. How they didn't freeze to death is beyond me. Some suffered serious frostbite. They spoke about that later, but what really defined her was that stubborn determination.
Были сильные обморожения и прочее. И вот то, что вот эта вот ее настырность, она могла бы поехать уже на родину.
She could have gone home. By then, she was already a decorated navigator, a recognized pilot. She could have returned safely with honor. But no, she caught up with her regiment and went right back into combat. It was something truly worthy of respect. And again, it speaks to her patriotism and to her need to fly.
Это чувство патриотизма и желание летать.
With her regiment, Khiuaz advanced all the way to the capital of Nazi Germany, marking Victory Day on the outskirts of Berlin. By the close of the war, she had flown 300 combat sorties. After the war, Khiuaz Dospanova was invited to join the party's administrative ranks.
Khiuaz Dospanova stands out as one of the top students at the High Party School under the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan. Not long ago, she was on the front lines, a decorated combat pilot who defended her homeland with a weapon in hand.
During her ideological training, Khiuaz Dospanova met the man who would become her husband, Shaku Amirov. Together, they built a quiet, enduring partnership that brought her not only love, but also the private happiness of family life. In 1950, they welcomed their first child, a son, Irbulat.
In 1952, my brother was born. His name was Kanat. In 1954, we traveled to Kostanay.
Поехали в Костанай. Значит, две бабушки.
Just the four of us. My grandmother Rahima, another grandmother Meruert, and the two of us, children.
Мой Михаил, Мируэль. Вот вчетвером мы поехали. Тогда очень долго приходилось.
Back then, travel took a long time. The train moved slowly, stopping often to let military convoys pass. The route itself made a wide detour before reaching Kostanay. Eventually, we arrived in the village. It was called Kuntimes. It's abandoned now, but back then it was a still proper settlement. Soon after we got there, we fell ill. We were both diagnosed with dysentery. I recovered, but Kanat, he was just 2 years old. I was 4. He didn't survive.
The loss left Khiuaz Dospanova in silent anguish, but it did not break her. She had known the weight of grief since her youth, and once again she carried it with quiet resolve. She threw herself into work. By then, she had been elected a member of the Supreme Soviet of the Kazakh SSR. In its inaugural session, she was appointed secretary of the Presidium, a position of both high honor and extraordinary responsibility. In that role, she was entrusted with some of the most consequential matters of state, decisions at the core of national governance.
Throughout her political career, Khiuaz Dospanova made a lasting impact on the city of Almaty. She was a key figure behind the construction of the Medeo high-altitude ice rink. Her efforts also helped shape the city's modern architectural landscape, leading to the creation of major civic institutions, including the Gani Muradbayev Palace of Pioneers. But her contributions extended beyond infrastructure. Alongside Gabit Musarepov and Ahmed Zhubanov, she championed cultural advancement, securing Kazakh language productions of Abay and Shokan Walikhanov.
Service to her country was second nature to Khiuaz Dospanova. She continued her public work, eventually serving as secretary of the Almaty City Committee of the Communist Party. Despite lasting injuries and chronic health struggles, she never lost the clarity of purpose and inner drive that had defined her youth. Her life stood as quiet proof that heroism does not end when the fighting stops. It continues in the effort to rebuild, to lead, and to shape a nation in times of peace. For many years, she lived in Almaty, where she earned the lasting respect of those around her. Even in later life, despite illness and advancing age, she remains spirited and engaged, attending veterans events and staying in close contact with her fellow service members.
Some of the most vivid memories I have are of May the 9th, Victory Day, which she marked every year at her home on the corner of Komsomolskaya and Mira. Veterans and wartime comrades would always gather there. They would share a meal, usually beshbarmak, and recall the years they had lived through together. and they always sang the same song. In the month of May, the guns have fallen silent. It was Aunt Khiuaz's favorite. When I was still in school, I used to visit her once a week, sometimes every 2 weeks. And I remember this clearly. Every time I left, Aunt Khiuaz would always hand me a 1 ruble note.
At the Military History Museum in Astana, the wartime honors of Khiuaz Dospanova are preserved with care. She was awarded several of the Soviet Union's highest military decorations, including the Order of the Red Star, the Order of the Patriotic War, 2nd class, and the Order of the Red Banner. Her service was also recognized with campaign medals, among them for the defense of the Caucasus and for the victory over Germany. In 2004, by decree of the first president of Kazakhstan, she was named Khalik Qahramani, People's Hero of Kazakhstan, the nation's highest title of honor. The museum also holds Dospanova's personal military file, a rare and detailed record. It includes a handwritten biography, her official service evaluations, and the attestation sheet for one of her military ranks. One excerpt reads, "Comrade Dospanova volunteered for the Red Army and has served with the regiment since its formation. She flew as a flight navigator, carrying out 300 combat missions. She never failed to reach a target. Beginning in April 1944, due to health reasons, she could no longer remain on flying duty and was reassigned as the regiment's communications chief. Throughout that period, communications remained uninterrupted. Even during frequent redeployments, her team kept the lines fully operational."
Her wartime comrade, military pilot Batluk, raised the issue with restraint and precision in an article titled "Navigator of the Guards Regiment." In it, she posed a question that remains difficult to ignore. Why was Khiuaz Dospanova never awarded the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union? The question was well-founded. At the time, the title was typically conferred on aviators who had flown more than 200 combat missions. Khiuaz completed over 300. She had been officially nominated. The paperwork was submitted, but the title was never granted. Most believe the decision was influenced by ideological considerations, not by any lack of merit.
As time went on, the consequences of everything she had endured began to show. In 2008, already at an advanced age, Khiuaz Dospanova suffered a serious injury, a hip fracture. For an elderly person, such an injury carries a high risk of complications. Her weakened body could not recover, and on May 20th, 2008, she passed away. Khiuaz Dospanova was buried at Kinsai Cemetery in Almaty, where many of Kazakhstan's prominent figures are laid to rest. Her name has been given to streets and public institutions across the country. And in 2020, following a petition by concerned citizens from her home region, Atyrau International Airport was renamed in her honor. We also put forward a proposal to Air Astana to name one of its aircraft after Khiuaz Dospanova, drawing on the international tradition of honoring distinguished aviators by inscribing their names on the fuselages of planes. With the support of my colleagues, the idea was embraced. Today, aircraft bearing the names of remarkable Kazakh women Khiuaz, Aliya, Manshuk, Ziryapa, Dina Nurpisova, Rosa Baglanova, Kulyash Baysitova, Gaziza Zhubanova, and Amina Umrzakova now fly across the skies. The legacy of Khiuaz Dospanova continues to instill in us a sense of patriotism, not as an abstraction, but as a lived responsibility to stand ready if needed to defend the land we call home. This message feels especially urgent in our time as we witness the rise of radical ideologies and an erosion of empathy in public life. The story teaches us to remain aware and grounded, to resist corrosive influences, and to contribute meaningfully to our country while preserving what connects us to our cultural roots. The character of Khiuaz Dospanova stands as a lasting expression of inner strength and national dignity. From the memoirs of Khiuaz Dospanova, we lived through the fire of war. We saw death, devastation, and the deepest human sorrow. We saw our land drenched in tears and blood. We saw exhausted Soviet citizens returning from captivity. We saw children, young men and women who had been taken into forced labor at the start of the war, coming home aged beyond their years. This must never happen again. It must never be allowed to happen again. Such is the will of all progressive humanity. Her passing was a profound loss for the country, but her memory continues to live on in the hearts of its people. She was a small woman, but she carried a vast and fearless heart, filled with unwavering love for her homeland. She left a lasting imprint on history and became a symbol of Kazakh aviation, of heroism, and of tireless devotion to her nation. For those who dream of the sky, Khiuaz Dospanova's life remains the first and clearest example.
С небом.